From Jeeps on rails to the train busters of World War II. Coming up on this V12 production special, we're talking all about how militaries have used the railroad. These days, trains loaded down with tanks and other armored vehicles turn a lot of heads. But these are actually more common than you'd think. And while the military trains you see today are not usually used on the front lines, that was not always the case. From the trench railways and giant guns of World War I, to the innovative way the Allies landed rail cars and locomotives on the beaches of Normandy during the Second World War, trains have always helped warfighters get the job done. So what does a present-day armored train look like? And what happens when a military train derails? All that and more is next on this V12 production special. Hello and welcome to this V12 production special, and thanks for joining us. Today, we're discussing how the U.S. Armed Forces and some other countries have used trains over time. And we'll begin by looking at how the American military utilizes the railroad in the 21st century. Now, it's pretty common to see military equipment transported by rail. This train was passing through Atlanta, Georgia in January of 2026. It was loaded down with Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, and other armored transports. Now, CSX operates this train over its railroad, but much of the equipment rides on Department of Defense flat cars. Rail fan or not, trains like these get everyone's attention. And they may also raise some questions like where do they go or how are all those vehicles loaded? Well, trains like these may be headed to maneuvers or training exercises somewhere in the U.S. They could also be in transit from the factory to a military base. Other vehicles transported by rail could eventually be taken off the train and shipped overseas. In addition to vehicles, some trains carry supplies and munitions. Ultimately, railroads would be critical in mobilizing the country for war. That's why they've been used by militaries around the world for well over 100 years. And yeah, the U.S. Army does have its own locomotives. They're mostly older engines from General Motors' Electromotive Division. But the Army also has some modern motive power like gensets that run off of multiple small diesel engines. And at the end of 2025, an all-electric locomotive was revealed at Fort Hood in Texas. Large military installations like Fort Hood have railheads where equipment can be loaded and unloaded. Ramps are typically used to load wheeled and tracked vehicles, and wheeled vehicles can roll from car to car using special bridges. Tracked vehicles don't need these. Cranes may also be used to load equipment along with forklifts. Everything is then secured to the rail cars. Now, operations like this don't just happen stateside. Members of the U.S. Armed Forces also move their vehicles and supplies by rail in other countries. This footage was shot at U.S. Army Garrison Humphreys in South Korea. Notice how, even though the rail cars are being used overseas, they still have U.S. markings. And this video shows soldiers unloading empty rocket pods in Poland. It looks like some military vehicles were also customized to help soldiers get the job done. This half-truck, half-locomotive was photographed at the Camp Carroll railhead in Korea in 1998. The cargo on these trains is right up there for everyone to see, but some military trains fly under the radar, so to speak. Here's a munitions train passing through Cartersville, Georgia. It really blends in with other trains on the rails, and you can see the military sees the value of using intermodal shipping containers to move its supplies. But as far as moving troops around, well, planes have filled that role. Now on the railroad, accidents do happen from time to time, but take a look at how well these military vehicles were chained down. As a taxpayer, this is probably something you do not want to see. Rail cars hauling pricey military equipment off the rails and on the ground. This happened in Colorado Springs, Colorado on October 9th, 2023, not far from Fort Carson. These photos are courtesy of the Stratmore Hills Fire District. According to 4th Infantry Division Public Affairs Officer Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Payton, the train was headed back to Fort Carson from Fort Irwin in California. Now, Fort Irwin is home to the National Training Center. The military spokesman said no one got hurt and the train wasn't hauling any weapons or hazardous materials. And it looks like whoever loaded these cars did a pretty good job. The trucks in the photos still appear to be chained down. According to a rail equipment accident incident report submitted to the Federal Railroad Administration by Union Pacific, an investigation found this derailment was caused by, quote, improper frog for the turnout combined with excessive guardrail wear allowed wheels to traverse the frog improperly. Okay, so at the start of each year, I like to do a little purge, and I'm talking about a purge of the applications on my phone that I just don't use anymore. But there's one thing that I'm definitely not deleting, and that would be the free Upside app. It doesn't waste your time or involve any doom scrolling or brain rot. It just saves you money. I mean, it fits into my life because it's just so easy to use. I pull up to the gas station, open the app, and claim the offer. As you guys know, I travel all over the Southeast making these videos, and it's really easy to find participating gas stations in the Upside app. And by the way, there may even be cashback opportunities at the grocery store or your favorite restaurant. Now, Upside has given back $1 billion to its users. To find out how much you can earn, download the free Upside app and use promo code LOCOMOTIVE to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas using promo code LOCOMOTIVE. Okay, let's get back to the video. In 2025, the country and the world got a chance to see how our military uses the railroad. It's late in the afternoon on June 5th, 2025, and it certainly looks like a normal day in Fairburn, Georgia. Down the tracks, a CSX local is busy switching cars. But the cargo that's about to blow through here is anything but normal. This train is led by a partially camouflaged locomotive numbered 1776. The engine is nicknamed the Spirit of our Armed Forces. Behind that, a blue locomotive celebrating CSX's company culture. But what'll really catch your eye is all the military vehicles this train is pulling. I'm talking about Abrams tanks, Paladin howitzers, Bradley fighting vehicles, Strykers, and more. So where's all this firepower going? Well, it'll eventually be unloaded outside Washington, D.C. and Jessup, Maryland, in preparation for a massive parade that celebrates the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army. That branch of the U.S. military was established by the Second Continental Congress on June 14, 1775. It was known then as the Continental Army. No doubt the U.S. Army has had a storied history since then. Now, days before the festivities, all this equipment was loaded up at Fort Hood, a task these soldiers have completed many times.
Railroad operations, it is a constant in the United States Army. So what you're seeing behind us, the taking the tanks, the Bradleys, Strykers onto rail cars, tying them down, we do it every time we go to the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California, or if units are going to the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Polk, Louisiana, or if they're going on a rotation or deployment, and this is nothing new. So if anything, this is another opportunity for soldiers to train, to be ready, and it increases their proficiency in conducting this type of operation.
Okay, here's the train arriving in the Washington, D.C. area before the grand celebration. June 14th, 2025 saw troops, vehicles, and aircraft on display in Washington. Of course, the Army's 250th anniversary celebration occurred during peacetime, but trains have been used in conflict since the mid-1800s in Europe. However, their worth was really proven during the American Civil War. During this time, trains hauled troops, supplies, and equipment. Some railroad cars even served as weapons platforms. Also during the Civil War, a United States military railroad was formed. It operated, constructed, and repaired lines seized by the U.S. government. With railroads being heavily relied on by the North and the South, sabotage became a tactic to fight the enemy. One of the most well-known stories in railroad history, the Great Locomotive Chase, played out during the Civil War. And in the 21st century, veterans and other guests boarded a special train to retrace the route and commemorate the sacrifices that were made. It's around 10 a.m. on Tuesday, September 30th, 2025, and CSX's Office Car Special is leaving Atlanta, headed north up the historic Western and Atlantic Main Line. About 45 minutes later, an honor guard is welcoming recipients of the Medal of Honor. They'll attend a special event here at the Southern Museum in Kennesaw before getting on the train. And here it is. In the lead, number 1776, named the Spirit of our Armed Forces. It's the middle of the day on a Tuesday, but there's still a decent crowd out here. This will be the start of a journey covering more than 80 miles to Ringgold, retracing the route of the Great Locomotive Chase during the Civil War. But to appreciate why this trip is happening today, we have to understand what happened way back then. It all started here in Kennesaw, which was once known as Big Shanty. This is where James J. Andrews, a civilian working for the North, and his group of raiders stole a locomotive and headed toward Chattanooga. Their plan? Destroy telegraph wires and tracks along the way in hopes of disrupting Confederate communications and troop movements. It was all set into motion on the morning of April 12, 1862. The men stole this locomotive, named the General. But the train's crew was not going to let them escape. The Confederate pursuers eventually acquired this locomotive, the Texas, and ran it backwards until the end of the chase. Andrews and his men were unable to take on wood and water and eventually had to ditch the General near Ringgold, Georgia. They were all caught, and James J. Andrews and 7 others were executed. And ultimately, several of the men were the very first recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor. But what about their Confederate pursuers? Well, they were hailed as heroes in the South, and 3 of them are buried here at Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta. Back in Kennesaw, let's take a close look at the train that's retracing the route of the Great Locomotive Chase. It's known as an Office Car Special and travels all around the CSX system. This paint scheme is inspired by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Of course, the B&O is one of the many railroads that would eventually make up CSX. I wonder if this is what a modern-day Capital Limited would have looked like. Now, typically trains like these are used for entertaining clients and VIPs and also allowing executives to get a first-hand look at the railroad. Many of the cars here are named for executives who led CSX and its predecessors. And one of the coolest cars here is probably the W. Thomas Rice. Rice was a very successful railroad executive who played an important role in the merger of Seaboard Coastline with the Chessie system, which formed CSX. This car has theater-style seating that faces this giant window that looks out onto the tracks. As you can see, it also has plenty of lighting. Just days before this historic event, the train made a deadhead run to Atlanta. CSX numbers 1, 2, and 3 typically lead the train. They're all ex-Amtrak F40PH-2s. Once the train was in Atlanta, CSX 1776 was added to the front. Okay, now, this is a very rare sight, a railroad actually washing its equipment. The CSX Office Car Special got a thorough cleaning before its trip to Kennesaw and Ringgold. And, as you can see, they did a great job. Now, there is a depot here in Kennesaw, but the W&A hasn't seen passenger traffic in a long time. Because of that, a special ramp had to be constructed at this crossing to load the train. And now, with the passengers on board, it's around 1:30 and the train is passing through Ackworth, Georgia. Next stop, Ringgold. More than 160 years after the Great Locomotive Chase and the introduction of the Medal of Honor, members of our military continue to make major sacrifices for this country. This day, this journey, and this train honors them. So, what happened to the engines that were used in the Great Locomotive Chase? Well, both are preserved in Metro Atlanta. The famous General, the one Andrews Raiders stole, is in Kennesaw at the Southern Museum. And the Texas, one of the locomotives that was used to pursue the Raiders, is preserved at the Atlanta History Center, and they're both worth checking out. Fast forward 50 years and the U.S. was entering another major war. America's military would be fighting a conflict on foreign soil, and many battles would take place in the trenches with weaponry that was more destructive than ever. Like in the Civil War, World War I saw heavy use of railroads to transport troops, supplies, and equipment on both sides. In the U.S., private railroads were nationalized under the United States Railroad Administration. In the government's eyes, the private railroads were not effectively handling the volume of traffic created by the war effort. Railroads were also being slowed down by labor issues and antitrust laws. The USRA existed from 1917 until 1920, and during that time, standardized railcar and locomotive designs were introduced. This was known as the USRA Standard. The federal government also tried to make railroad operations leaner and streamlined in hopes of getting munitions, supplies, and troops to their destinations more efficiently and quickly. Meanwhile, in Europe, specialized railroads and equipment were being used on or near the front lines. Heavy artillery was extensively used by both sides. Narrow-gauge trench railways were built to transport munitions, men, and supplies. They were relatively easy to construct using unskilled labor. Some track was prefabricated while other lines were built from scratch. These lines were often linked up with standard-gauge railways that were farther away from the front and out of range of enemy artillery. In this case, soldiers stepped off a standard-gauge train and onto the narrow-gauge line. Most of the motive power consisted of small tank engines, but some locomotives were gas-powered. Railway guns were also used by both sides during the First World War. These were often the size of the gun you'd find on a naval vessel and could fire very long distances. In fact, some were just repurposed naval guns. Guns of this size would have been very difficult to transport over the roads of the time. But these specialized weapons had a major flaw. Aiming them, more specifically traversing the gun that was mounted on the railroad car, was difficult. In some cases, curved track would be built to get the gun pointed in the right direction. And the gun's recoil also had to be accounted for. During the war, some countries also developed armored trains. They had no problem carrying heavy weapons and thick armor plating, but obviously their mobility was limited. After a short period of peace, the world was once again at war, and railroads would play a critical part in the Allied march to victory. The use of armored trains would continue into the Second World War. This Polish armored train was destroyed by the Germans as they began their invasion. World War II would also see the development of one of the largest weapons ever built. Known as the Heavy Gustav, this German 31.5-inch railway gun rode on two parallel tracks. It saw some action as the Germans battled the Soviet Union. The United States would soon enter the war following the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Although iterations of it had existed in the past, the modern form of the U.S. Army's Transportation Corps was established in 1942. Within that was the Military Railway Service, which was structured very much like a civilian railroad. It had folks who repaired equipment, maintained the right-of-way, and people dispatching and, of course, operating the trains. One of its most amazing accomplishments during World War II was landing locomotives and rolling stock shortly after D-Day. This equipment would be used to get France's railways rolling again. U.S. forces used vessels called landing ship tanks, or LSTs, that were specifically modified for railroad use to get everything across the channel and into France. And quick-setting concrete was used to temporarily embed rails in the beaches. Of course, the United States also provided locomotives and other rail equipment to its allies. Manufacturers had to make sure that equipment could handle the tighter clearances of European bridges, station platforms, and tunnels. Locomotives for narrow, standard, and broad gauges also had to be designed and built. American manufacturers also had to adapt their designs with things like different couplers and braking systems. Okay, so here's a huge adaptation. Some Jeeps had their rubber tires swapped out for steel wheels. They were used to survey rail lines and occasionally pull rail cars. This scene shows Lord Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command, riding the rails in Burma. While the men of the military railway service focused on operating railroads, Allied pilots were given the task of destroying them.
The jackpot!
Gun cameras from so-called train busters show enemy trains and rail yards obliterated from above. The bomb that hit this yard was powerful enough to lodge this steam engine and its tender up in the air. Meanwhile, this locomotive ended up in a crater. And unfortunately, this French locomotive was also a target of a bombing raid. Alright, take a look at the side of this pilot's plane. It shows he destroyed an enemy Iron Horse. Now, military and resistance forces were also taught how to sabotage enemy lines. This was actually harder than you might think. A 12-inch gap made with explosives in this rail didn't even slow the train down. According to this training film, long gaps, offset, on each rail would need to be made to ensure a substantial derailment. When it was all said and done, World War II would see the deployment of millions of men. According to a Popular Science article from February 1945, 42,000 men and 2,000 officers were recruited from America's railroad companies to use their trade to help the war effort. In fact, the big Class I railroads actually sponsored operating and shop battalions, meaning their employees became military railroaders who were shipped out overseas. And back home, civilian railroaders did their part hauling military equipment, supplies, and troops. The conflicts in Korea and Vietnam saw the U.S. military rely more on the native railroads in those countries. U.S. servicemen would take more of an advisory, administrative, and supervisory role. But, like in previous wars, railroads were still seen as prime military targets. Here you see some South Vietnamese troops, along with a U.S. advisor, assigned to protect rail shipments as they traveled through the jungle. Although strategic bombers and ballistic missiles got most of the attention during the Cold War, the U.S. government was still prepared to utilize railroads all over the world if war broke out. At the beginning of the Cold War, both the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, in partnership with General Electric, and General Motors' Electromotive Division, built special diesel-electric locomotives that had multi-gauge trucks and a narrow loading gauge, allowing them to operate on railroads that had tighter clearances than the lines in America. Jumping ahead to the end of the Cold War, and the U.S. would begin to develop trains that would be able to carry and launch missiles. They could be moved around America's rail network and would hopefully be able to avoid detection by the Soviets. In December of 1986, the White House announced the research and development of specialized trains carrying Peacekeeper intercontinental ballistic missiles. This diagram shows how a train would be made up. According to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, 50 Peacekeeper missiles would be deployed on 25 USAF trains, and each train would carry 2 missiles. Here's one of the prototype launch cars. It's currently on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Now, it's unclear if trains would be disguised like commercial rail cars, like in this artist's rendition. Ultimately, the Peacekeeper rail garrison system never became operational, and with the Cold War over, the program was canceled in 1991. But at the beginning of the 1990s, the military continued to rely on civilian railroads in the U.S. to transport military equipment. The same was true during the Iraq War in the 2000s. During that time, coalition forces did provide some assistance to the Iraqi railways, including protecting trains from insurgents. As we've seen, railroads are now used almost exclusively to transport military equipment, but some countries still use them as weapons platforms. It's September 2021 in North Korea, and a short train is emerging from a tunnel. It looks relatively conventional until people in hazmat suits emerge and the roof of one of the boxcars starts to open. What rises from the rail car is deadly, a short-range ballistic missile. A montage of different camera angles show its successful launch. The video then shows a second missile rise from the boxcar and blast off. Fortunately, this was all just a test, but it does raise some concerns. The website 38north.org analyzed this video that's from North Korean state media. They say trains like this could be disguised as civilian freight trains, could be hidden in tunnels or camouflaged on sidings, and decoy trains could also be deployed. Fortunately, Allied forces could indiscriminately attack rail lines to reduce the train's effectiveness. As I said, this video shows short-range ballistic missiles, which are commonly carried by large, all-terrain trucks. But the advantage of a rail vehicle is that it can carry heavier, long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. But it's unclear if North Korea will be able to adapt its train to haul deadly cargo like that. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union also developed a missile train, but that program was canceled. The armed and armored train you see here is in use by the Russian Federation. The country reportedly has multiple trains like this. Russia is a giant country with a large rail network, and it still uses trains to move its troops, supplies, and equipment, and the train here may be a way to protect its logistical efforts. This train appears to be equipped with thick steel plating, anti-aircraft guns, and even an armored locomotive. Here in the U.S., many railroads have paid tribute to veterans and active duty service members by painting commemorative locomotives. Now, I've already shown you CSX's locomotive numbered 1776, but here's another engine that came long before it. Following the first Gulf War, Union Pacific painted this locomotive in camouflage. It was named Desert Victory. It featured placards listing the names and hometowns of the 66 Union Pacific employees who served in that conflict. More than 2 decades later, Union Pacific revealed number 1943, known as the Spirit. Its paint scheme honors all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces and was made in collaboration with veterans who worked for Union Pacific. Okay, here's Norfolk Southern's Honoring Our Veterans locomotive. It was revealed in 2012. And in 2018, Kansas City Southern unveiled this boldly painted engine. Of course, there are many more specially painted locomotives out there that I just don't have images of to show you. So are there any railroaders in the military today? Well, the Army still has a limited number of reservists who fill this role. They're designated as 88U, railway specialists in the Army's Transportation Corps. According to the Army, these men and women supervise and operate the Army's locomotives. They also help with rail planning, coordinate the use of host nation or contracted rail assets, and carry out instructions received from signal towers, switches, and other trains. Countless military railroaders have been trained here on the Fort Eustis Military Railroad in Virginia. In fact, other branches of the armed forces send their personnel here for railroad training and licensing. However, civilian railroaders and contractors currently handle much of the railroad work being done at military installations in the U.S. We've now reached the end of this special. Some of the topics we covered could probably be explored further. I'm sure I could make an entire documentary about railroad use during World War II, but we'll leave things here for now. I hope you learned something after watching this, and if you did, I'd encourage you to share this video with your friends and family. I'd also invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Anyway, that's it for now. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.